chapter next describes two recurring concepts that we're going to see throughout the rest of the book, and therefore need defined here early on. The first is syntax. This refers to those rules and regulations that language has that specify, for instance, that you could say something like, who did the hired assassin kill the mayor for? But you couldn't say, who did the hired assassin kill the mayor and? And if you read on page 26, even though that doesn't make sense to us, you could use that phrase in a non-syntactic way, in other words, a way that breaks the rules, to mean something like, aside from the mayor, who else did the hired assassin kill? Listen again. Who did the hired assassin kill the mayor and? In other words, like, who else? Who else did the hired assassin kill? And the funny thing about this is that the rules are so arbitrary. How do we decide that we can say, who did the hired assassin kill the mayor for, but we can't say, who did the hired assassin kill the mayor and? We see also in this section that there are other rules described. These are combinations of sounds. This is not referring to syntax, which is the rules by which we order words within a sentence. But we also do have rules about which sounds within a language can go together. You could see there in the last paragraph on page 26 that if you have the letters R, P, M, S, T, and O, that you could combine those letters in all different kinds of sets, but only some of them would be logical to us, not in terms of meaning, but in terms of what makes sense for a word, what feels like it could be the potential to be a word. But some of these are definitely not, like erpmsto. That has no potential whatsoever to be a word in English, but trumps is a word in English, and strump could be a word in English. It isn't, but it could be one. So you can see there that there are also rules that dictate the order of sounds within a word. The next important principle is one called recursion. Recursion refers to this ability of language users to nest phrases or clauses within other phrases or clauses, so that we could essentially create a sentence of an almost limitless length. A sentence could go on and on and on, embedding additional clauses within other clauses, and is only limited not by the power of language, but by our ability, cognitively, to follow what it is that's going on in the sentence. The example given of this in box 2.3, down at the very bottom of that first column, says, Bianca and the girl who lives next door to John's brother jog. You can see recursion at play here because John's brother first is one clause. But John's brother is not actually an actor in this sentence. Rather, it's the girl who lives next door to John's brother, as well as Bianca. Recursion is an important aspect of human language because it is an aspect of language that is absent from the communication methods used by other animals. For instance, even when chimpanzees learn sign language, they use telegraphic speech, very simplified short statements that do not embed clauses within other clauses, as we see above in the sentences given, such as Washo tickle, Lana eat, Sue give, dog growl. Those sentences, well, most of those sentences, are legitimate sentences, but they don't exhibit the property of recursion. Now, the syntactic rules that dictate whether you can use a recursive clause in one way or another, in combination with all of the other syntactic rules that we see for grammar and for structuring words together, have led some researchers to suggest that it is not possible for young children, for infants, to begin to learn language without some kind of inbred, native cognitive structure in their mind. In other words, they have said that there must be some kind of universal grammar, or in other words, some kind of universal prefabricated structure within which we can place our language, and that all languages have the same basic structure, the same basic format. Nativists also have pointed to the fact that there is some very large gap between the experiences that young children have had and the knowledge that they have. For instance, we don't have to stop and teach our children that you can say, "What did you hit Billy for?" but you cannot say, "Who did you hit Billy and?" meaning, who else did you hit in addition to Billy? That young children end up having vast amounts of knowledge and understanding of how language works that has never been explicitly taught to them in the same way that you might sit down and teach a child to do arithmetic. In addition to this last fact, nativists also have pointed to the inherent drive that people have to learn language no matter what. Even when they're deprived of linguistic input, they still feel a drive to invent languages themselves. So one example that we'll talk about more extensively later in the chapter is the example of home sign, where young children who are deaf and are born to hearing parents don't have any linguistic input because they can't hear the language that their parents are using. They will instinctively, through some drive to communicate, invent a home sign, a system of language. It's not as sophisticated or as complete as a full-blown language is, but they will invent some system of communication that, especially when used in combination with other groups of individuals, can become as sophisticated as a language is. So we seem to have some kind of innate drive to invent languages or to learn languages, and that young children even engage in these kinds of practices for fun, like they practice with language, they practice with sounds, they practice babbling in ways that doesn't have to be encouraged or exhorted out of them, that they can just that they just engage in these behaviors because it's enjoyable to them. And these are the pieces of evidence that nativists point to and suggest that indeed there must be some kind of built-in structure, some universal grammar that's true for all languages, that is an empty framework, a skeleton within which we can place our language, whatever the language that we have invented for ourselves is. We place it within that structure, within that, place it on that skeleton. On the other hand, anti-nativists have rebutted against these claims of nativists with several important points. As you can see on page 29, from about halfway down the page, there are 5 very specific points that rebut the nativists' point of view on all these things. The first is that infants experience a lot more input than we previously had thought. We were saying that there is some enormous gap between the experiences that young children have had and their knowledge of language, that they couldn't possibly know as much as they do about language, given the very slight inputs that they've had, the very little instruction. But interestingly, we see that that new research has come out to suggest that children do in fact practice a lot more than we previously thought, and are processing information that their parents are sharing in a much more systematic way than was previously thought. In box 2.4 on page 33, we read about the babbling phenomenon among human infants, that when they're exposed to linguistic input from their parents, that they practice making sounds that are consistent with the language that their parents are using. Babbling ends up being consistent with the phonemes that they have heard. So, phonemes is a word that we haven't introduced yet, but basically consistent with the sounds that exist in their parents' language. So we will hear that there are different accents and different sounds involved in babbling infants of an American heritage versus English heritage, and we'll find that based on the babbling of Japanese infants, it will sound dramatically different from those who speak English or French or any other language. We also see that infants who are raised by deaf parents and are therefore exposed to visual language rather than auditory language babble with their hands as opposed to babbling with their mouth. And this suggests that babbling has an imitative function, that it's practicing making the sounds or the signs that their parents have made to them. Now back to that first point on page 29. that infants are actually exposed to a lot more information than previously thought. We're going to talk more about this when we get to Chapter 4, but infants are processing and hearing streams of linguistic input all through their entire throughout their entire first year or two of life, and they're constantly parsing out individual bits of sound and calculating statistical probabilities about the language that they're hearing. Specifically, what kinds of sounds are likely to coexist with other kinds of sounds. And if two sounds are likely to appear together in their parents' linguistic input, then the infants will be more likely to babble those sounds and be more likely to perceive them as plausible words within the language. But there are other combinations of sounds that never appear together, and the infants are processing those as implausible sounds. The second point here on page 29 suggests that many linguistic components are in fact rooted in general cognition. So not only can babies process linguistic input, they appear to do it using general cognitive structures. The third point here is that much of what we previously thought was specific to humans actually isn't really specific to humans. That many of these cognitive structures appear in animals when the demands are placed upon them that require them to behave in the ways that are consistent with human language. The fourth point on this page is that language patterns that were once thought to be universal are actually not universal. If you turn to page 489 in your text, you can see a figure here that describes the word order preference within lots of languages across the world. So most languages have either an SOV or an SVO word order. That's a concept that will come clearer as we go throughout the term, but in English we use an SVO word order. In other words, I go to the store. I am the subject, the verb is go to, and the object is the store. So in our sentences we would say, I go to the store. In some languages they would reorder that so that the subject and the object both come first and then the verb comes later, so that you would say something like, I, the store, go to. And if you have become familiar with some second language, you probably have noticed that it is either one of those two word orders. But you can see there that there are other possible word orders. Indeed, literally any combination of word orders can be used. Some of them, as you can see, are not common. The last one, the orange dot there, is object, subject, verb, and only 4 known languages in the world have that word order. But still, they exist, and children who learn those languages don't appear to be impacted in their ability to grasp their parents' language or to master it, suggesting that there can't actually be some kind of universal grammar within which languages always fall, but rather any word order, for instance, that's one aspect of language, not the only one, but that any word order is possible across the world, even though there are some preferred more than others. The final point made in favor of the anti-nativist view is that the anti-nativist theory is actually a more parsimonious explanation than the nativist view. Parsimony is a word that we use to refer to Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is usually the best one. If you have two competing explanations, and one requires more leaps of logic, more complications, then the simpler explanation is the one you should go with, unless there is ample evidence to suggest that that one is wrong. So if we compare the nativist and the anti-nativist views with each other, you can see that the nativist view is more complicated. It requires more leaps of logic, that we have evolved some universal grammar or some cognitive structure specific to language, requires more of a leap of logic than we have general cognitive structures that enable us to master language that didn't evolve specifically for language.